The strange thing about losing someone is that sometimes they disappear long before they ever walk away. At 4:17 in the morning, the streets of downtown Chicago looked washed in silver rain and exhausted silence. A city that usually screamed with sirens and headlights now breathed slowly beneath the fog hanging over Lake Michigan. Naomi Carter stood alone outside her apartment building with one suitcase beside her and a paper coffee cup growing cold between her hands. The yellow street lamp above her flickered against the damp sidewalk while jazz music drifted faintly from a passing taxi somewhere down the block. She looked up one last time at the tiny third-floor window she had called home for almost 4 years. Then she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded café apron, and carefully left it on top of the suitcase she wasn't taking. Her fingers lingered on the embroidered name stitched across the fabric. Riverside Café. She swallowed hard before stepping backward into the rain like someone quietly erasing herself from the world. 20 minutes later, the apartment was empty. No goodbye. No forwarding address. No explanation. Only a half-finished letter sitting beside the kitchen sink beneath the weak glow of a stove light. By sunrise, the woman Ethan Whitmore couldn't stop thinking about had vanished completely. Ethan didn't notice she was gone until nearly 11 that morning. He arrived at Riverside Café wearing the same charcoal wool coat he always wore when he wanted to disappear into normal life. No bodyguards. No assistants. No polished black SUV waiting at the curb. Just a 6'2" billionaire walking into a neighborhood cafe where nobody knew his last name. The smell of cinnamon and dark roast coffee wrapped around him the second he stepped inside, but something felt wrong immediately. The music was too quiet. The register girl looked nervous. And the small corner by the window where Naomi usually stood preparing orders sat empty beneath the warm hanging lights. Ethan slowed near the counter. "Where's Naomi?" he asked softly. The young cashier avoided eye contact while wiping down the espresso machine. "She quit." Ethan frowned. "Quit?" "Last night." The words landed harder than they should have. Ethan glanced instinctively toward the table near the front window where he always sat after board meetings pretending to read reports while secretly watching Naomi laugh with customers and carry warm plates of blueberry pancakes to exhausted nurses finishing overnight shifts. For the first time in months, the cafe felt cold. Empty. Like the soul had quietly left the room before anyone noticed. "Did she say where she was going?" Ethan asked. No, the cashier hesitated before sliding a small white envelope across the counter. "She left this behind. I think she meant to throw it away." Ethan stared at the envelope without touching it. Rain rolled softly against the windows while steam curled upward from untouched coffee machines behind the counter. Outside, Chicago moved forward like nothing had changed. But inside Riverside Café, something had already ended. Ethan finally reached for the envelope, his fingers tightening slightly when he noticed Naomi's handwriting across the front. No name. No address. Just one unfinished sentence written in black ink. "I liked the man at the cafe, not the billionaire." The first time Ethan Whitmore walked into Riverside Café, he had only meant to stay 5 minutes. That had been 7 months ago during the coldest week of January, when Chicago wind sliced through downtown streets hard enough to make people lower their heads and forget to look at each other. He still remembered the snow melting across the shoulders of his coat while his phone vibrated endlessly with calls from investors, attorneys, and reporters waiting for statements about the Whitmore Holdings merger that had already made financial headlines across the country. Ethan had ignored every call before stepping into the warm glow of the cafe just after 9 at night. At the time, Riverside Café had been nearly empty except for a tired couple sharing pie near the back and a young woman wiping down tables while humming softly beneath old jazz records crackling through ceiling speakers. Ethan remembered noticing her hands first. Calm hands. Steady hands. The kind that carried warmth instead of stress. She had looked up and smiled politely when he entered, but there was nothing performative about it. No recognition. No fascination. No nervous excitement. Just kindness. Kitchen closes in 15 minutes, she told him while tying her apron behind her waist. But the coffee is still fresh. Ethan had almost laughed at how ordinary the moment felt. Nobody spoke to him like that anymore. Most people treated him like a headline before they treated him like a person. He ordered black coffee and sat near the window while snow drifted quietly beyond the glass. Naomi brought his cup over herself a few minutes later. "You look like somebody had a worse day than the weather," she said gently. Ethan glanced up in surprise. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who work late nights," she replied. Then she pointed toward his untouched phone buzzing across the table. "You should probably answer that eventually." "I was hoping you would say the opposite." Naomi smiled faintly before walking away. That should have been the end of it. But Ethan came back the next night. Then the night after that. Eventually Riverside Café became the only place in the city where he could breathe without feeling watched. Naomi never asked what he did for a living. She never searched his face trying to place him in magazines or business interviews. Instead, she asked things nobody else asked anymore. "Did you eat today? Are you sleeping enough? Why do you always look sad when it rains?" Little questions. Human questions. Ethan learned pieces of her slowly over time. Naomi worked double shifts to help her younger brother through nursing school in Milwaukee. She loved Ella Fitzgerald records and terrible blueberry muffins from a bakery 6 blocks away. Every Sunday night after closing, she sat alone by the window sketching strangers into a small notebook while jazz music played softly through the speakers. Ethan never told her how much he began rearranging his entire schedule around those quiet nights at the cafe. Outside Riverside, he was the man newspapers called ruthless. Inside, he was simply Ethan. Sometimes they talked until nearly midnight while chairs rested upside down on tables around them. Sometimes they sat in silence listening to rain slide down the windows. And sometimes Naomi looked at him with a softness that made him forget how lonely his life had become long before he ever walked into that cafe. By early spring, Ethan had developed a habit he could no longer explain to himself. Every evening around 8:30, no matter how brutal the meetings had been or how many millions of dollars moved across conference tables that day, he found himself driving toward Riverside Cafe like his body already knew where peace lived before his mind could argue with it. Chicago looked different at night from inside that neighborhood. Softer somehow. Less interested in power. Street musicians played saxophone beneath flickering train platforms while steam drifted from subway grates into cold evening air. Riverside sat quietly between a laundromat and an old bookstore with fogged windows and handwritten menus taped beside the front door. Most people walked past without noticing it. Ethan noticed everything about it now. Especially her. Naomi had a way of making ordinary moments feel rare. She remembered customers by name. She knew which regular liked extra cinnamon in their coffee and which exhausted paramedic needed silence more than conversation after midnight shifts. Sometimes Ethan watched her move through the cafe carrying plates beneath warm amber lighting while old jazz records played overhead, and he wondered how someone could look so calm inside a world that never stopped demanding things from people. One rainy Thursday night, the power briefly flickered during a storm. A few customers groaned quietly while thunder rolled outside near the river. Naomi lit candles across the cafe without panic, smiling softly while the room settled into golden shadows and warm silence. Ethan looked around at the small glowing tables and laughed under his breath. "You make disasters look comfortable," he said. Naomi placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him before sitting across from him for the first time since they met. "That is because people only remember how you make them feel when things go wrong." Ethan studied her carefully in the candlelight. "And what do I make people feel?" Naomi tilted her head slightly like she was considering the answer honestly. "Intimidated at first," she admitted. "But mostly sad." Ethan smiled faintly. Sad? You always look like you are waiting for something bad to happen even when nothing is wrong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant headlights slid across the wet street outside. Ethan realized then how unusual this was. Nobody challenged him anymore. Nobody observed him closely enough to notice things he spent years hiding behind expensive suits and controlled expressions. Yet Naomi saw through him effortlessly. Maybe I just work too much, he said quietly. Naomi shook her head. No. It feels older than that. Ethan looked down at his untouched coffee. She was right. The loneliness inside him had started long before Whitmore Holdings became one of the largest real estate companies in America. Long before magazine covers and interviews and million-dollar negotiations. Somewhere along the way, success had slowly replaced every real relationship in his life with transactions. Every conversation became strategic. Every dinner became networking. Every smile came with expectation attached to it. Except here. Except with her. Naomi suddenly laughed softly while looking toward the front counter. You know what is funny? What? You still come in wearing those expensive coats pretending nobody notices. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You noticed? Ethan, those shoes probably cost more than my monthly rent. He laughed harder than he had in weeks, the sound surprising even himself. Naomi smiled watching him carefully, and for one suspended moment beneath candlelight and rain, Ethan forgot he owned skyscrapers, investors, and entire city blocks. He was simply a man sitting across from a woman who made him feel human again. The truth entered Ethan's life on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon wearing a gray suit and carrying a stack of development contracts under one arm. He had been sitting inside the top-floor conference room at Whitmore Holdings while Chicago sunlight reflected against glass skyscrapers outside the windows. 12 executives filled the room discussing profit forecasts, demolition permits, and redevelopment timelines for the Riverside District renovation project worth nearly $400 million. Ethan listened quietly while scrolling through financial reports on his tablet, barely paying attention until one sentence made him stop completely. The old café tenants will receive 90-day relocation notices beginning next week. Ethan slowly looked up. Which café? The room went silent for half a second. His chief legal officer adjusted his glasses. Riverside Café among others. The entire block falls under Phase 2 demolition. Ethan stared at the digital blueprint projected across the wall. Blue lines. Property divisions. Future luxury towers. Parking structures. Rooftop restaurants. In the middle of the map sat a tiny highlighted square labeled Riverside Café. For the first time since the meeting started, Ethan could no longer hear anyone speaking. A strange pressure settled inside his chest while memories rushed through his mind all at once. Naomi laughing softly behind the espresso machine. Naomi sketching by the window after closing. Naomi standing beneath warm hanging lights asking if he had eaten dinner yet. Ethan's voice came lower this time. Who approved this phase? The executives exchanged confused looks. You did, someone answered carefully. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Months earlier, before Riverside Café had become important to him, he had signed dozens of redevelopment documents without reading every small business affected by the project. To him, it had simply been another expansion. Another acquisition. Another district transformed into profit margins and architectural renderings. But now all he could picture was Naomi standing inside that little cafe while strangers decided her future from polished conference tables 30 floors above the city. Postpone Phase 2, Ethan said suddenly. The room froze. His financial advisor blinked in disbelief. Postpone? Indefinitely. Ethan, investors already approved I said postpone it. His voice remained calm, but sharp enough to silence everyone instantly. After the meeting ended, Ethan stayed alone inside the empty conference room watching clouds drift over Chicago through floor-to-ceiling windows. He suddenly understood something uncomfortable about himself. Naomi had never known who he really was because he had enjoyed escaping into a version of himself untouched by money and power. But that illusion came with consequences. Every peaceful night inside Riverside Cafe had existed because people like him controlled the city around people like her without ever being seen. That evening Ethan arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. Naomi stood near the counter arranging fresh pastries beneath warm lights while soft jazz floated through the speakers overhead. She smiled when she noticed him entering. "You are early tonight." Ethan loosened his tie slowly, trying to ignore the weight sitting in his chest. "Long day." Naomi studied him carefully. "You look like somebody told you bad news." Ethan almost told her everything right then. About Whitmore Holdings. About the redevelopment project. About the fact that he owned more of her neighborhood than she could possibly imagine. But when he looked at her standing there smiling at him with complete trust, the words refused to come out. Naomi handed him his usual coffee before leaning lightly against the counter. "You know," she said softly, "I think this place would disappear without people noticing." Ethan looked around the cafe quietly. The old wooden tables. The scratched tile floor. The rain beginning to streak softly across the windows outside. Then he looked back at her. "I would notice," he said. 3 nights later, Ethan stood in front of his penthouse window overlooking the Chicago skyline while his assistant adjusted the cufflinks resting beside him on a marble counter. Downtown glittered below in silver and gold beneath the dark evening sky, but Ethan barely noticed the view anymore. His attention remained fixed on the message Naomi had sent earlier that afternoon after nearly a week of him avoiding difficult truths. "Hope your meeting goes well tonight. Do not forget to eat dinner this time." The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any corporate negotiation ever had. Ethan picked up his phone twice to call her before putting it back down again. He still had not told her who he really was. And now it felt too late. "The car is downstairs, Mr. Whitmore," his assistant said carefully. Ethan nodded once before reaching for his coat. 30 minutes later, the grand ballroom of the Blackstone Hotel glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and soft orchestra music. Politicians, investors, celebrities, and executives moved through the room holding champagne glasses while cameras flashed near the entrance. Ethan usually hated events like this, but tonight felt different because Naomi was somewhere inside this world with him. When she finally stepped through the ballroom doors, Ethan forgot every conversation happening around him. Naomi wore a deep emerald green dress that moved softly as she walked beneath the chandeliers, her curls resting naturally against her shoulders while nervous fingers adjusted the small silver bracelet on her wrist. She looked elegant without trying to. Real in a room full of performance. Ethan crossed the ballroom toward her immediately. "You came," he said quietly. Naomi smiled softly. "I almost did not." Ethan offered his arm gently. "You look beautiful tonight." A faint warmth touched her expression before she glanced around the ballroom uneasily. "I feel like I accidentally walked into a movie." Ethan laughed under his breath. "Trust me. Most of these people are pretending too." For a while, the evening surprised both of them. Ethan introduced Naomi to a few executives without titles or explanations. They danced once slowly beneath golden lights while an old jazz standard played through the ballroom. Naomi relaxed enough to laugh again, and Ethan realized he had not seen her this happy outside Riverside Cafe before. Then everything changed in less than 30 seconds. A sharply dressed woman approached them near the balcony entrance holding a glass of wine. Victoria Langford. Daughter of a real estate billionaire and someone Ethan had spent years avoiding rumors about in business magazines. Victoria smiled politely at first before recognizing Naomi from somewhere she could not immediately place. "Wait," she said slowly while studying her face. You work at that little cafe downtown, do not you? Naomi's smile faded slightly. Yes. Victoria turned toward Ethan with open amusement. This is your date? Ethan's expression hardened immediately. Victoria. But she continued anyway. Interesting choice. I honestly thought she was catering staff when I walked over. The air around them suddenly felt colder despite the music still playing nearby. Naomi stood perfectly still beneath the chandelier lights while conversations continued across the ballroom like nothing had happened. Ethan stepped forward sharply. That is enough. Victoria lifted one shoulder carelessly. What? I am only saying people are going to talk. Ethan looked toward Naomi instantly, but the damage had already settled quietly across her face. Not humiliation. Worse. Understanding. A painful kind of understanding. Like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together all at once. Naomi glanced slowly around the ballroom filled with luxury watches, designer gowns, and people greeting Ethan Whitmore like royalty. Then she looked back at him. Whitmore, she repeated softly, almost to herself. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Naomi swallowed once before forcing a small smile that barely reached her eyes. You never told me your last name. Ethan opened his mouth, but no explanation sounded honest anymore. The ride back from the gala felt longer than any flight Ethan had ever taken across the world. Rain slid silently across the windows of the black town car while Chicago lights blurred outside like distant memories already disappearing. Naomi sat beside him with both hands folded quietly in her lap, staring out at the wet streets without speaking. Ethan had tried twice to explain himself before stopping halfway through each sentence because every version sounded dishonest the moment it left his mouth. He hated that look in her eyes now. Not anger. Not even disappointment. Distance. The kind that appeared when trust broke somewhere too deep for quick apologies to reach. When the car finally stopped outside Riverside Cafe, Naomi opened the door before the driver could move. Naomi, Ethan said softly. She paused beneath the rain. Without turning around completely. You should go home, Ethan. The way she said his name hurt more than he expected. Formal now. Careful. Like she was already separating herself from the man she thought she knew. Ethan stepped out into the cold rain after her. I wanted to tell you. Naomi laughed once under her breath, but there was no warmth in it. When? She asked quietly. Before or after I found out your company owns half the city? Ethan froze. Naomi turned toward him slowly beneath the flickering cafe sign. Do you know what hurts the most? She continued. It is not the money. It is not the buildings. It is the fact that every single night I told you things about my life while you sat there already knowing you had the power to change it whenever you wanted. I never wanted power over you. But you had it anyway. Rain gathered along the edges of her curls while headlights passed behind them on the empty street. Ethan took a step closer carefully. Naomi, listen to me. Riverside matters because you are there. She shook her head immediately. No. Riverside mattered before me. Her voice remained calm, but Ethan could hear exhaustion underneath it now. The exhaustion of finally understanding how unequal their worlds truly were. Naomi looked toward the cafe windows glowing softly behind them. Do you know how many nights I worried about rent? She asked. How many double shifts I worked because my brother needed tuition money. Meanwhile you were sitting there pretending to be ordinary while people like me spent our lives trying to survive decisions made by people like you. Ethan had no answer for that. Because she was right. The silence between them stretched painfully while rain continued falling around the empty street. Finally Naomi reached into her purse and pulled out the silver fountain pen Ethan had once lent her weeks ago while she sketched customers after closing. She placed it carefully into his hand. You should keep this. Ethan looked down at the pen before lifting his eyes back toward her. Naomi, please. For the first time that night, her expression softened slightly. Not enough to heal anything. Just enough to make what came next even harder. The worst part is that I really liked you, she admitted quietly. The man at the cafe. The man who listened to jazz records and complained about cold coffee and looked lonely every time it rained. Ethan felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. Naomi stepped backward slowly toward the cafe entrance. But now I do not know which version was real. Before Ethan could answer, she disappeared inside Riverside Cafe and locked the door behind her. He stood alone outside beneath the rain watching her silhouette move silently through the warm lights inside. A few minutes later, the cafe lights shut off one by one until only darkness remained behind the windows. Ethan stayed there nearly an hour after she left, staring at his reflection in the glass where her reflection used to stand beside his. For the next 6 days, Ethan returned to Riverside Cafe every night at exactly 8:30 even though Naomi never looked directly at him anymore. She still served customers with the same quiet kindness. Still remembered regular orders. Still smiled politely at strangers walking in from cold Chicago evenings. But with Ethan, something had changed completely. Their conversations disappeared first. Then the small laughs. Then the comfortable silences that once felt warmer than most relationships Ethan had known in years. Now there was only distance wrapped carefully in professionalism. Your coffee, Naomi would say softly while setting the cup down without sitting across from him anymore. Thank you, Ethan would answer, already knowing she would walk away before he could say anything else. The cafe still smelled like cinnamon and roasted espresso beans. Jazz music still drifted through the speakers after sunset. Rain still painted silver streaks across the windows some nights. Yet none of it felt the same now. Ethan finally understood how fragile peace could be once trust cracked beneath it. On the 7th night, he arrived carrying a small paper bag from the bakery Naomi loved 6 blocks away. Blueberry muffins. Still warm. He noticed immediately that Riverside looked strangely empty. Chairs rested upside down on several tables even though the cafe was supposed to remain open another 2 hours. The young cashier behind the register looked nervous the second Ethan walked in. Where is Naomi? Ethan asked quietly. The girl hesitated before answering. She is not here. Ethan glanced around the cafe. Did she leave early? Silence. Then the cashier slowly reached beneath the counter and handed him a white envelope. Ethan recognized Naomi's handwriting instantly. His chest tightened before he even opened it. She quit this morning, the cashier said softly. Ethan looked up sharply. What do you mean quit? She packed her things before sunrise. Ethan stared at her, unable to process the words. Where did she go? Nobody knows. The sounds around him suddenly dulled into strange silence. Even the jazz music overhead felt far away now. Ethan opened the envelope carefully with unsteady fingers. Inside sat a single folded sheet of paper torn from a notebook. He recognized the handwriting immediately because he had watched Naomi sketch with those same careful hands dozens of nights by the cafe window. Ethan unfolded the page slowly. I think some people meet each other at the wrong point in life. Before they know how to stay. Before they know how to tell the truth. You asked me once why I always looked out the window when it rained. It is because leaving has always felt easier during storms. I liked who I was before I learned how small my world looked beside yours. Ethan stopped reading for a moment, swallowing hard before continuing. The man I met here made me believe quiet things still mattered. Coffee after midnight. Jazz records. Conversations without pretending. I do not know if that version of you was real, but I hope somewhere underneath all the buildings and boardrooms, he still exists. Goodbye, Ethan. There was no signature beneath it. Just a small coffee stain near the bottom corner like she had stopped writing halfway through a shift. Ethan stood motionless inside Riverside Café while evening traffic rolled outside beyond the rain-covered windows. He looked toward the corner table where Naomi used to sketch strangers after closing. Empty now. The chair slightly pushed back like someone had left in the middle of a conversation. Did she say anything else? Ethan finally asked quietly. The cashier shook her head. Only that Chicago stopped feeling like home. Ethan folded the letter carefully before slipping it into his coat pocket like something fragile enough to break if handled carelessly. Then he looked around Riverside Cafe one last time and realized the room no longer felt warm without her inside it. Summer arrived in Chicago without asking Ethan whether he was ready for it. The city grew louder, brighter, more alive, while something inside him seemed to move in the opposite direction entirely. 3 months had passed since Naomi disappeared, but Riverside Cafe still looked frozen in the version of life she left behind. Ethan had quietly purchased the building 2 weeks after she vanished and canceled the demolition project permanently without telling anyone the real reason why. Investors complained. Board members argued. Financial analysts called it an emotional mistake. Ethan ignored all of them. Some nights he still sat alone at the corner table by the window after closing while employees cleaned quietly around him. He would unfold Naomi's unfinished letter beneath the warm cafe lights and read the same lines over and over until midnight blurred into early morning. Somewhere underneath all the buildings and boardrooms, he still exists. Ethan wanted to believe she had been right. But loneliness had a way of forcing honesty into people. For the first time in years, Ethan started noticing things he once ignored completely. The janitor sleeping on the train platform near his office building every Tuesday night. The exhausted waitress working double shifts at a diner 2 blocks from Riverside. The small businesses quietly disappearing every month because wealthy developers saw neighborhoods as opportunities instead of homes. He had spent most of his life building towers high enough to avoid looking down. Naomi changed that without even trying. One humid August evening, Ethan sat through another corporate fundraiser inside a luxury hotel ballroom while executives toasted record profits around him. Halfway through the event, he quietly walked out before dessert was served. He drove aimlessly through downtown with the windows lowered, warm summer air rushing through the car while old jazz music played softly from the radio. At a red light near the river, his phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was Marcus Reed, one of the few people Ethan trusted outside business. You still looking for her? Marcus asked carefully. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Every day. There was a pause. I might have something. Ethan's heartbeat slowed instantly. What kind of something? A friend of mine owns a jazz lounge in New Orleans, Marcus replied. He sent me a video last week because he thought the singer looked familiar from a photograph on your desk. Ethan did not speak for several seconds. Send it. By the time Ethan pulled the car over near Grant Park, the video had already arrived. His hands actually shook opening it. The recording lasted less than 40 seconds. A dimly lit jazz lounge. Soft piano music. Candlelight flickering across crowded tables somewhere deep in New Orleans. Then the camera shifted toward a small stage. Ethan stopped breathing. Naomi stood beneath golden lights wearing a simple black dress while singing into an old silver microphone. Her voice moved through the room slowly and warmly like midnight rain against windows. The audience sat completely still listening to her. But it was not just the singing that struck Ethan. It was her expression. Calm now. Stronger somehow. Like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. Ethan replayed the video 4 times before noticing one final detail. Naomi was smiling again. Not the careful smile she wore during difficult days at Riverside. A real one. Quiet. Free. Ethan leaned back against the driver's seat staring out at the Chicago skyline glowing beside the lake. For months he had imagined finding Naomi somewhere lonely and heartbroken because that version would have made his guilt easier to carry. But seeing her alive inside another city, building another life without him, forced him to confront a painful truth. Naomi had not disappeared to punish him. She disappeared to save herself. And for the first time since she left, Ethan understood that loving someone might also mean becoming the kind of person who deserves to be found again.